Welcome. I'm Alice Antonelli, a Director of Advisory Services here at Nonprofit Finance Fund, and I am joined by my colleague, Meadow, Didier. In this video, we have picked 3 FASB updates that we think will affect most of our clients and their financials. We'll talk briefly about what is changing regarding net assets, expenses, and liquidity so that you have a clear picture of what's staying the same and what's changing in these categories. So first up are net assets. And we really just have one change here. So net assets used to be divided into 3 categories: unrestricted, temporarily restricted, and permanently restricted. Now we will have 2 categories: net assets without restrictions and net assets with restrictions. The second category groups all of the restriction levels together. We will still have to provide information about the nature and amounts of different types of donor-imposed restrictions, and you can do that in the notes. FASB is hoping that by requiring only 2 rather than 3 classes of net assets to be presented on the face of financial statements, it will reduce complexity in financial reporting and increase the clarity of the information provided. So here's one example, and we're looking at the statement of activities, and you can see that we've got a column format here. Now, FASB says that we can be flexible. We can give as much detail or as little detail as we would like. So in this example, we've got a little bit more detail on time restrictions, program restrictions, and endowment. But if you wanted to, you could stay with just 2 categories: the without restrictions category on the left and the restrictions category as a summation. On the statement of financial position, this is the net asset area on the statement of financial position. Now, we have on the top net assets without donor restrictions and a little bit of detail there. And on the bottom, we have net assets with donor restrictions, and again, detail there. So FASB is giving us flexibility. We can give a lot of detail, like as shown here, or if you wanted to just have 2 lines, that's completely fine. Net assets with donor restrictions and net assets without donor restrictions. Now, in terms of disclosures or the notes, not much is new, but since we are merging the restricted net asset category together, that is taking temporarily restricted net assets and permanently restricted net assets and combining them, we will want to do that in the notes as well. So we'll have one note for all restrictions, and you'll list out the different nature and type of restrictions and their amounts. Now, lastly, just want to give you a heads up that if you do have board designated net assets, then you will be required to disclose information about them in the notes. It was optional before, but now it's required. Now I'm going to pass it over to Meadow, and she'll take us through expenses.
Thanks, Alice. Okay, so for expenses, not much is changing here. So let's take a quick look. The key takeaway here is that nonprofits were previously only required to report expenses by function, which looks at whether an expense functions for programs or admin or development. But now we're also required to provide a natural breakdown of expenses, and that's looking at the nature of the expenses. It's salaries or travel or supplies, etc. This requirement is helpful because the natural classification of expenses just gives us a much better sense of which expenses are fixed versus variable and what it costs to provide our services. So in this example, you can see expenses by function across the top and then by nature down the side. This matrix format is just one way to present this analysis of both nature and function. It is the most common way, and many organizations are already providing this. So if you are, great, you don't have to change anything. And if you're not, there's also a lot of flexibility here. You can do this analysis on the face of the statement of activities as a separate statement or in the notes. Regardless of how you do it, you do have to include a disclosure. So let's look at the disclosure. The disclosure is giving detail around how an organization allocates natural expenses like salaries and rent to those different functional categories of program, admin, fundraising. The key part of this disclosure is that last part. So in our example here, the organization explains that for occupancy expenses, they are using square footage to allocate. And then for certain salaries, they're using time tracking to allocate. You'll see that this note just focuses on the natural expenses that do need to be allocated, because not all of them are allocated. Okay, let's move to liquidity. The liquidity update, this is perhaps the most important one to pay attention to, just because everything about it is brand new in terms of being required to report about it. This change here is really about both liquidity and availability, because those are slightly different, as you'll see in a second. And it also has two parts. So FASB is requiring both a qualitative part that communicates how a nonprofit manages its liquidity to meet cash needs in the next year, and then a quantitative part that communicates the availability of financial assets. For the qualitative part, let's look at an example of an organization explaining what it does to make sure it has funds available to pay the bill. In this case, they have an operating reserve, and the purpose of that reserve is to meet their unplanned cash needs. And then the note goes into a little bit more detail. It talks about the target balance for the reserve is $120,000, and the current amount in the reserve is $60,000, and that's being held in cash and cash equivalents. If our example organization here had a line of credit that they use to help manage liquidity, then that information would be here too. The next piece is availability. And this is because not all cash is necessarily available, and then also not everything that is available in the next year is cash. So the quantitative info is looking at what is both liquid and available in the next year. When we say availability of a financial asset can be affected by three things. It can be affected by the nature of the asset, because some aren't, like fixed assets or longer term assets aren't available in the next year. It can be affected by restrictions, which are external limits imposed by donors, or designations, which are internal limits imposed by the board of directors. So in our example, this organization lists their assets, and then they back out those assets that aren't available, starting with assets that aren't available because of their nature. Those are the long-term receivables, and then assets not available because of time restrictions, and then those not available because of designations. And in this case, it's the board designated operating reserve. And they're left with those financial assets available to meet cash needs for general expenditures within the next year. You don't have to include all of this information in a chart like this. You certainly can, but you can also just include it in the narrative. And that could even be the same narrative as the liquidity piece. So liquidity and availability can be in one note. You can do what makes the most sense for you and your organization. And with that, that concludes our mini webinar. Thank you so much for listening. Please visit our website at nff.org for more detailed information.